Welcome to everybody out there to this new edition of our Enes Insights podcast. My name is Roy Kanadag, researcher and academic director at the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen. I'm very much looking forward to this talk today because it touches on a very important and sensitive topic, namely the Gaza War. The war is about to enter its 9th month since the Hamas terror attacks of October 7, 2023, and it shows no real signs of ending anytime soon. Now, this is all very troubling and irritating, not only because of the unresolved fate of the Israeli hostages, and not only because of the massive devastations and destructions it brought for the Palestinians, but also because of one specific irritation it caused, which has to do with the question what it is that drives Israeli politics in this war. And there, more concretely, one may ask, how is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanahu still able to determine where this war is headed? And that despite all the diplomatic pressure on Israel, despite all the domestic opposition as seen in the anti-government demonstrations that have been picking up recently. Despite all this, nothing seems to get the Prime Minister and the government to rethink and to reflect upon their decisions. And we may ask now, what drives Netanyahu and his policies, and why, apparently, can he not be reined in? And to discuss these issues, we are very happy and honored that we have with us none other than Guy Laron. Thank you for being here with us, Guy.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to briefly introduce you. Guy Laron is a senior researcher at the Hebrew University's Department of International Relations in Jerusalem. He is an accomplished expert on the history of Israeli, regional, and international politics, interests that he convincingly connects in the two books that he has already published on the matter. The first one being The Origins of the Suez Crisis, Post-War Development, Diplomacy, and the Struggle over Third World Industrialization, published in 2013 with Johns Hopkins University Press, and The Six-Day War, The Breaking of the Middle East, this one was published in 2017 by Yale University Press, among several other articles on these issues. And like so many other Israeli colleagues, Guy is a very attentive observer of current Israeli affairs. And I suggest to all listeners that you at least follow his Twitter account, because here you may get some very good on-the-spot analyses and comments on the war, on the conflict, on Israeli social dynamics. And then every couple of months, there are very good longer pieces to read. Let me name this one piece from May 21st in the Jacobin called Israel's War is Not About Bringing Down Hamas, and most recently a text called Israel's Bonaparte, which was published in the current edition of the Catalyst Journal. So, Guy, maybe we start just with that question. What drives Netanyahu in this war?
The most important thing, I know it sounds reductive, but the most important thing for him, and even more importantly for the coalition that still supports him, Netanyahu has right now a majority in parliament, and despite everything that's happened, it's unshakable. Okay? There is not even a shadow of a hint of a sign that any member of his current coalition is even considering voting to bring down the government. Okay? So that's a paradox, right? For outside observers, like what's going on, what more needs to happen in order for his supporters to understand that he's leading Israel in a disastrous direction. So another thing that I should bring as a background is that Netanyahu and his coalition has a majority in parliament, but they do not enjoy a majority in public opinion polls. So broadly, you would say that, were elections to take place now, the current coalition would lose about 12 seats, which would send them to the opposition benches. Okay, so he did lose support among the public. But why is his coalition is stable, and why something like 45% of the electorate is still willing to vote for the parties that consist of his current coalition? So the argument in the Catalyst piece, Israel's Bonaparte, is they don't have anywhere else to go. What the ultra-Orthodox, the West Bank settlers, and basically parts of the working class living in Israel's periphery, they have a strong sense that the left or the center left doesn't care about them, and would in fact conduct a very harsh austerity economic policy that would hurt them. It's not a speculation. That's exactly what happened in that brief interim where Bennett and Lapid formed a change government, as it was known, between 21 and 22, and conducted a very Thatcherite, you might call, economic policy. So Netanyahu's electorate sticks with him no matter what, because they feel they have no alternative. I think what really, I mean, if you think what is the most active, most important part of the coalition, it's the West Bank settlers. They have the vision. The others are, they joined the ride, but it's the West Bank settlers that drive the policies of this government from the what was known as, in the American press, they call it the judicial coup. I don't know how they call it in German, but something similar, right?
I don't know exactly about what the German translation is. I would assume something like Verfassungsputsch or so, but I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
But yeah, it was strongly in the media here as well. Yes.
Which the judicial coup polarized Israeli society and weakened it, something that both Hamas and Hezbollah observed shortly before the 7th of October attack. But what the judicial coup would have enabled was the annexing of the West Bank, which is like, it's hard to explain to people how important it is for West Bank settlers. They have homes, they have property, sometimes very nice property, on the hills in, northern West Bank, Samaria, and it's not theirs. It's not listed in the registry as theirs, as long as this territory is not officially annexed to Israel. So that's part number one, and part number two is the insistence on unending the war in Gaza. Why not end it? Because in all probability, that would bring about the downfall of the government. But if it won't bring about the downfall of the government, that would open the arena for a substantial political process that would bring about the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, that's a mortal danger for the settlements in the West Bank. So not ending the war is a way to ensure that there will never be a conversation about how a Palestinian state would come about. We may argue, if you like, how realistic that plan is. Can it come about? Are they delusional or just, coldly realistic, those West Bank settlers? But that's their plan, that's their vision.
And they cannot vote anybody else. So let's say with Netanyahu off the political map, where would they go? Would they not just go with Likud and some others on the far right?
Yeah, it's just that Netanyahu is, he proved himself again and again as the most efficient electoral machine to bring a majority. And when they look around and they say, okay, so who would lead us in the next elections? They don't see anyone on Netanyahu's stature in the Israeli political map. And, one of the reasons is that Netanyahu, got rid of anyone that could jeopardize his position as the leader of the center right. No, I mean, some of them would be willing to criticize him, but they're not a majority.
Mm. So Benny Gantz's recent decision to leave
Yeah.
the war cabinet, I mean, what do you think with his calculation? And does he think this will have an impact on how Netanyahu calculates what his majority
Uh,
will be?
yeah, I mean, Gantz is different from Netanyahu, although yeah, a lot of Israelis see him as too wishy-washy to represent them. There's something soft about him, although he's an ex-general. He always seeks the compromise. I think his calculation was that when he joined the government shortly after the 7th of October attack was that this is way too serious to leave the matter to those crazies now in the cabinet. So the only guys that had the expertise to consult, advise, monitor the military activity were Gantz and his number two, Gadi Eisenkot, and both of them were ex-chiefs of staff. So they had a lot of experience and a lot to contribute to the debate. Later on, I think the calculation was that they can influence matters somewhat, but also it proved, at least in the beginning, hugely successful electorally. So the polls are still showing Gantz and the party that he leads as the majority party in the next elections. They, according to the polls, they were more than double their seats in parliament. But at the same time, it seems that he stayed too long in the coalition, that it was hard to see that what was the best window of opportunity to jump out. And when he did make a decision belatedly, it's a little bit too late. I think the plan was to show to Netanyahu's voters that he has no personal animus towards their beloved leader. And if this is the case, they can trust him as well. He doesn't hate them. He has a beef with Netanyahu. It's businesslike. It's not personal. So that had a measure of success, but will he succeed in capitalizing on his, supposed achievement in public polls when we get to the ballot box? I'm not sure.
Do you think Gantz would have made a bigger impact had he taken this decision after in the US Congress there are very many critical voices and even people like Chuck Schumer informally calling for the resignation of Netanyahu? Would that have been a better point for somebody like Gantz to step in?
For example, there were several, but for example, that would have been a good point to jump ship. And then underline the fact that there is a deal, there is a hostage deal on the table, and Netanyahu is preventing it. At that time, at that point of time that you talk about, the Chuck Schumer censor, and then there were other voices in Washington saying that a lot of Israelis didn't believe that their government would be that cynical, that malevolent to reject a deal that gives Israel some of what it wants, give Hamas some of what it wants, and then both parties can end this round of fighting. A lot of Israelis thought, no, there must have been some good reason for Netanyahu to reject the deal. And had Gantz resigned, saying, no, I think it's so serious, the rejection of the offer now on the table, that I decided to resign the government. That could have helped, shock Israelis out of their torpor. But now I think now there's too much fear and too much fatigue for Gantz's departure to really destabilize the government.
In these conflicts over the alleged hostage deal, there is some confusion among German observers as to why the hostages and their families and their activism is not seen as something that could have an impact, because there's this image here that, you know, it was all about the hostages and then the hostages' families and their performances in public that shook Israeli politics. So why did that not have an effect these past months, would you say?
Oh, it did have an effect. I think the government would not, you know, Netanyahu would not even go through the motions as if he's considering the deal if it weren't for the pressure they applied on the government. But to understand why the pressure of the families of the hostages wasn't more effective is to understand the depth of the crisis in Israeli society, because the majority of those that were kidnapped are seen as part of the voters of the center left. Those kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope, a lot of them became, you know, kind of a lifestyle suburbs of the bigger city in the south, in the Negev, Beersheba. You know, lawyers, psychologists, teachers of all sorts, but you know, the kind that they hire in good high schools, musicians. They're not the same social strata that supports the current coalition. And if there's anything that typifies this government, is they work only and only for the voters. I don't know how to explain it sufficiently for those listening to this podcast in Germany or outside of it, but they have seen nothing like it. They don't even pretend to be ruling in the name of the people at large. They work only for the ultra-Orthodox, only for West Bank settlers, only for identified voters of the Likud, Netanyahu's party. They don't even, you know, bother with even the semblance of a government that work for everybody, no matter what. We are the Israeli government. We work for all Israelis, whether they voted for us or they're not even saying that. It would seem petty, perhaps, but there was a large expose in one of the main news channel of what the transportation minister is doing. And she apparently has this kind of table of municipalities that are loyal to the Likud, activists that can work for her in the primaries, and they get colors according to their seniority. So getting a green color in her table is good. It's all documents that were leaked to a leading investigative journalist. So if you get a color, it's good. But if you don't get a color, if you're colorless, she won't bother to meet you. She won't bother to work for that municipality. And most of the time, she doesn't care about running her ministry. The only thing she cares about is meeting political activists. Yeah. So that's that. But I mean, maybe her case is the most flagrant. It's the one that most pokes you in the eye. But maybe she was careless in writing down the mechanism of how she works. But all of the ministers work like that, officially or unofficially.
I mean, but Israel has a pluralist and activist press, and many journalists and people who expose these things are leaked. People write about this.
It's under threat. It's under threat. Israeli journalism. In fact, Israel get very low marks currently on the global index of freedom of the press. We're if you look at the table, we're not in good company. And as happened in Hungary, for example, Netanyahu was very good at making sure that tycoons who support him would buy media outlets and make them into a mouthpiece, not necessarily of the Likud, of Netanyahu personally. We have a version of Fox News right now in Israel. I'm not sure that even on Fox News they allow themselves to say what they say on the Israeli version of Fox News. It's very hateful, very polarizing. A majority of the printed press is now in friendly hands to Netanyahu. So there is a debate. There's a stormy debate on social media for sure. Yeah. But I mean, one way to think about it is like, is Netanyahu winning? The democratic space, I don't know if you use this term, this is how we talk about it in Israel, the democratic space, it's getting smaller and smaller, where you can express your opinion, demonstrate, etc. So one way to look at it, that as the democratic space gets smaller, Netanyahu is winning. Another way to think about it, that had his views were truly hegemonic, right, and acceptable for the majority of the Israeli society, you wouldn't need this kind of widespread suppression in various ways. So is it like a signs of his victory and a march towards an urban-like or Erdogan-like regime in Israel? Or is it the first sign of the implosion of the social coalition around Netanyahu? I think both possibilities coexist right now in our present.
What would you say are the areas where he is not successful, where he cannot achieve his aspirations and his goals?
The judicial system is still not in his hands. Parts of it are the lower echelons, but no, everything about the vision of Netanyahu right now is inimical to the jurists, both those that are judges, but also the lawyers. They're the Law Association in Israel, which is a strong institution, influential institution. So they took a clear position against the judicial coup and also against this coalition. They have representatives in the committee to appoint judges, and their voice is pretty strong against what Netanyahu is trying to do. The structure of Israeli society is indeed very different than in Hungary, or Poland, or India, or Turkey. The service economy is stronger. The strata of the educated bourgeoisie is bigger. I think in this case, it's more similar to what's happening in the United States. The professionals that are still a big chunk of the workforce, they're against Netanyahu. The doctors, for example, the psychologists, the high-tech sector. So they're still fighting. And I think, grosso modo, they also have nowhere else to go. I mean, you can estimate a few thousands professionals have left since the beginning of the war. But I don't know if there's a world out there that is thirsty to so many high-tech engineers, so many doctors. So Israel is their home. So they need to fight. I'd say in general, answering your question, the technocratic class, whether it's jurists or journalists or professors, they're still leading the fight. Sometimes we get tired, sometimes we get demoralized, but then we go back to it because we have no other choice. We also have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, I mean, the protests of these past, I don't know, 2 years now have been quite impressive, and also they have picked up again in these past months. That was a sign of hope, at least, that many in in Europe and the West Sea. But maybe to come back to your current piece, where you have a bit of a longer temporal frame when you speak of class relations, of class politics. So you've touched on this earlier, but could you maybe elaborate a bit on that more and why it's useful to have such a perspective also?
Well, I think immodestly that it's a useful perspective to have, not just about Israel, not just to understand Israel, but what happens in developed countries at large right now, this kind of populist politics that you have everywhere. Netanyahu is an extreme case, but there's Netanyahu lookalikes even in France right now, for example. So, and then it's a kind, maybe it happened to you too as a scholar, that you start writing a piece and you get in the end to conclusions you did not expect, that you thought you know your argument to begin with, and then you end up with an argument that surprises you. And what I think a lot about, like, my class, the class I belong to, that Barbara Ehrenreich, the American journalist, called the professional managerial class. Its acronym is PMC. So in the article, basically, I looked at the history of the Israeli PMC, which is, maybe kind of a navel gazing, but still I was interested in what we have done as a class within Israeli society to prevent what is happening right now. And my conclusion of this history was that, firstly, the Israeli PMC was very enthusiastic about neoliberalism. Some of the push to go toward that direction came from the US. That's true. American officials from the late 70s, were very interested in exporting their views or their economic theories into the countries of their allies. But as one reviewer that helped me craft the piece said, it feels from your article that the Americans were pushing against an open door. So that's also true, that Israeli economics professors bought into the economic theories of Milton Friedman and spoke fluent Friedmanese. And in fact, Milton Friedman was invited to Israel in the summer of 1977 when the Likud came to power. They treated him like, an artifact. They did the Likudniks. They didn't really consult him. They wanted his name, his authority, but not his advice. But they got a lot of help, the Likud, in instituting the institutional arrangements of Israeli neoliberalism. So on the one hand, it created a lot of jobs for the PMC because they would supervise the market, and that helped sell the system to the electorate. We use the market as the best allocation system, and we're telling you it's the most efficient allocation system. But also, you should know that very serious people in the Bank of Israel, at the Treasury, are looking at it. If something is wrong, they will fix it. As the Likud's first prime minister in power, Menachem Begin, said once, there are judges in Jerusalem. It's a very famous quote in Israel, saying that the Supreme Court of Justice that sits in Jerusalem has a lot of power, and you can trust the judges that nothing would go wrong. So the neoliberal revolution in Israel gave a lot of power also to jurists and economists. And they wrote the laws that passed through parliament that actually passed the power to make decisions about economic policy from politicians to technocrats. The parliament and the ministers had less and less say about, say, how high would be the interest rate, or what is the allowed size of the budget deficit. That was, the sole possession of the PMCs of various sorts. And then the PMC didn't vote Likud, they voted Labor. So it's the same process that Thomas Piketty, the French economist, described as turning the working class parties into a Brahmin left, a left that represents the Brahmin class of the society. So that is exactly what happened in Israel in the 80s. The Labor Party was even more neoliberal than the Likud. And every time Labor was in power, it instituted even more stringent, more orthodox neoliberal policies than the Likud. Likud had its own shtick that works until today. It administers a harsh dose of budget austerity and privatization, yes. But for the sectors that are dependent on the Likud, it delivers benefits. And that, by the way, that connects to what maybe the listeners are more interested in is the occupation in the West Bank. The first thing they did in 1977, the Likud government, was to stop the building of public housing inside the Green Line, that is the Israel of before the 1967 conquest, but allow cheap housing to be built in the West Bank. So obviously within 3 to 4 years, housing prices within Israel rose dramatically. But anyone who tried to buy a house in the West Bank, in towns that weren't that far from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and a very thick network of roads was built in order to allow people living in those basically suburbs to reach very quickly to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So, and that's interesting. It wasn't public housing in the West Bank. Yeah. It was built by private contractors that incidentally always broke the law. Often they won a tender and then they built more than they were allowed to, but never mind, it was legalized afterwards. But you got cheap loans from the government to buy your apartment in the West Bank. So the lower bourgeoisie and the working class suddenly had an outlet and access to cheap housing. Yes, it was in the West Bank, but it's ours. And so that's I think it's a great example of how the Likud captivated its electorate. Okay, so what defined the left in Israel? The left in Israel, the parties of the PMC, they said, no, we want neoliberalism, but without the compensation mechanisms of the Likud. So every time there was a labor government, they froze building in the West Bank. So you're saying it's good, right? I'm not for the occupation, of course, but it was also bad because they didn't offer an alternative. If there aren't any cheap housing in the West Bank, you should build more public housing within Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, but they didn't do that. So the left got locked into positions of more and more extreme neoliberal positions, while the Likud was also neoliberal, but at least it offered some crumbs to those that decided to support Likud. So that's what happened in Israel. But I think in some respects, that's not so dissimilar to what happened in a lot of Western countries.
Yeah, maybe the Israeli case would be a bit of an exception because the Labour Party really, eroded and crumpled. So other social democrats are also in the process of, structural weakening, losing their bases, etc. But so far, maybe in 10 years, it will be different in Germany and France, Italy as well. This downfall of the Labour Party is maybe a bit specific.
Right. It may be that there's more industry left in Europe than in Israel. That in Israel, Haifa, for example, that if there'll be a war in the north, you'll hear about a lot in the news. Haifa was like a typical Detroit. It was an industrial town. And when industry left, basically in the 80s and 90s, then Haifa really sunk. And it didn't fully recuperate since. So maybe the process of deindustrialization in Israel was more extreme. That may be the case.
So is there any, I don't know, option for, let's say, service workers? I mean, PMC is one part, all the service workers is another part of a, deindustrialized economy, etc. So where are they politically?
I mean, you can see consistently that people with university education, they would go for the center left. It's very sharp. You can see it very clearly. High school education and below, they would go for the center right. And then there's there's the fine tuning that, for instance, the universities in Israel are considered to be delivering a better quality of education than the colleges. So college educated might go for Likud in some professions. But again, grosso modo, the PMC is very supportive of the Israeli left. It might be that in European eyes, the Israeli left doesn't seem left enough. I think many Israeli lefties in their position, in the German context, you'd think that they vote for the CDU, right? Yeah. Anyway, going back to your questions, I think the divisions, the class divisions, that's part of our problem in Israeli society. Is very rigid, and so is our politics as a result.
So a war is usually so destructive that sometimes it's so shattering that it may be able to,
Right.
cause a reorientation, some reflection, maybe also give some impetus, and some politicians having some momentum in, let's say, not creating new parties, but maybe new platforms to offer an alternative to this, very activist class. I mean, again, there's been hundreds of thousands in the streets this last year before the war. So where do they all end up politically, and why is there no chance for a unified anti-Bibi?
So it's a very good question. So now I'll speculate, right? Because we're talking about the future.
Sure.
I won't say what I want to see happening because it doesn't help. I don't think the scenario I prefer has a chance of being materialized. One direction is that Netanyahu somehow ekes out another victory. And he can do that because, as we already said, large parts of the media actually support him. Also, that extreme right minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, I think the whole world already knows his name, he controls the police. That's very dangerous. So we might see acts of voter suppression in any elections that would come about, especially against the Arab citizens of Israel. That's the easiest, right? You turn on the outcasts, the foreigners. So and then I think Israel would look more and more similar to Turkey in a sense that its position in the Cold War would be kind of hedging. And it also would be dysfunctional in the same way that Turkey is. It's easy to think how Turkey could be a much richer economy and would work much better if it wasn't for Erdogan. And the same thing would the standard of living in Israel would be lower. There would be less professionals working in the exodus of doctors, say, and high-tech workers would continue. So that's direction number one. Direction number two, you talked about an anti-Bibi alternative. So there is the anti-Bibi right. There is such a thing. And if you look at the opinion polls, it's getting stronger and stronger. And I should say that the parts of the media that don't support Netanyahu are in the hands of the plutocrats. So they would also, I think, would like to see a strong right-wing party, which is anti-Bibi. So I think and now I think what happened in the last few months, they did additions to various people that the plutocrats wanted to lead that anti-Bibi right-wing party. So they tried the ex-head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen. I think it fell flat. It didn't succeed. And I think they tried Gantz, but yeah, a kind person, a good person. I think his politics are way better than Bibi's, but maybe he doesn't have that killer instinct. So now they're thinking about Yvette Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. He has rich experience. He was the Minister of Finance, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Transportation. Each time for a short period, he has this tendency to resign abruptly and slam the door behind him, what people don't do, as you say. But it now seems that the TV channels are warming up to the idea of an anti-Bibi party that Lieberman would lead. And that's another realistic direction of an Israeli neoliberalism without compensation mechanism. And the ones that would pay the ultimate price for what happened would be the ultra-Orthodox. They don't have enough of veto power. I don't think they play smartly with their cards, and they don't serve in the army. It's just like the main issue for Israeli society. We're at war. How come you don't serve? My son is going to die. What about yours? How can you sit in the yeshiva all day studying while our sons are shedding their blood for the motherland? So, and that would be his line. I think that would be the line of the anti-Bibi party. We'll do Bibiism without Bibi, except for cooperating with the ultra-Orthodox. It's their time to pay.
Thank you very much, Guy, for these very insightful, comments, impressions, analyses. I think we've learned a lot from you.
Okay, thank you very much for this conversation.